The late afternoon light on the training grounds outside Kummersdorf fell in long, copper-coloured bands across the sand and pine scrub, the kind of fading light that made steel look warmer than it truly was. The grinding sound of a Maybach engine idling in the distance blended with the murmured conversations of mechanics, officers, and the ever-present clatter of tools against concrete. It was the middle of autumn in 1944, and Germany's weapons testing centre was running at a frantic, almost nervous pace. The front was moving closer to the homeland now, and every week another battalion commander sent requests for evaluations, assessments, anything that might arrest the momentum of Allied armour pushing inexorably from the west. Unteroffizier Jakob Reimann stood beside a vehicle he had never expected to see intact, let alone operate. A captured American medium tank, an M-four-A-three Sherman, sat before him, the white star hastily painted over with dark yellow, and the stenciled American serial numbers still visible beneath the applied German markings. Rain had washed some of the camouflage striping into streaks that looked like old tears running down the hull. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He ran a gloved hand across the welded armour plate above the glacis and felt the faint ridges left by American factory tooling. The tank smelled different from German vehicles, less oil and hot metal, more of the rubber in the track pads and the paint used inside the turret. Even that small difference carried weight. Machines carry the culture of their builders, and Reimann, a career tanker, could sense the foreignness as clearly as if he had stepped into a stranger's house. The order that morning had been simple. Take the captured Sherman for a controlled evaluation, document its mobility characteristics, and if time allowed, conduct a performance comparison against the Panzer IV and Panther. The paperwork used the controlled, impersonal tone of technical testing. But the truth was unmistakable. Nothing at Kummersdorf in late 1944 was neutral anymore. Every test now had a desperation behind it. A cold wind blew across the yard, carrying with it the smell of fuel and distant pine sap. Reimann pulled his scarf up to his jaw and watched the exhaust drift from the American tank. It wasn't merely curiosity that tightened his throat. It was something closer to unease, a sensation he would never have admitted to anyone in uniform. Because here, in the fading light of a shrinking Reich, an American tank was preparing to reveal something German doctrine had never taught them to expect. The Panzer crews gathered that day, including Reimann's crew from the 7th Panzer Regiment, would soon discover the central irony that would lodge in their thoughts long after the war ended. The enemy's tank that German propaganda claimed was inferior, underpowered, and simplistically built, had an unexpected advantage, one that contradicted nearly every assumption drilled into German armoured doctrine since 1939. They were about to learn that the Sherman could run and run faster than almost anything they had. That revelation would not arrive as a dramatic explosion or a cinematic duel between armour and fire. Instead, it would emerge in the quiet, methodical process of testing a captured machine, under the watch of officers and engineers, whose expressions grew stiffer with every completed run. Reimann would later say in an interview recorded in the early 1960s that the moment he opened the Sherman's throttle fully was the moment the world cracked slightly, like a door opening to a room we had refused to enter. But to understand why that discovery mattered, why it shook men who had spent years inside Panzers, we must go back earlier, long before that captured machine rolled into Kummersdorf, into the doctrinal roots of German tank warfare, into the propaganda that shaped soldiers' expectations, and into the industrial realities that determined how fast, how far, and how reliably a tank could truly go. The German armoured ideology had been built, layer by layer, on a set of core beliefs established even before the first shots of the war. The Reich's armoured doctrine prized firepower, precision engineering, and frontal armour thickness. German tank development emphasized superiority in direct confrontation, the ability to defeat enemy armour head-on through technical excellence and carefully coordinated combined arms tactics. The Panzer divisions of 1939 through 1941 had been the embodiment of modernity in motion, their sleek forms thundering across Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union. And with early triumphs came a narrative cultivated deliberately by propaganda ministries that German armour represented both technological and moral superiority. The Panzer was portrayed as the cleanest symbol of national strength, its qualities presented as evidence of Germany's industrial discipline. Magazines showed Panthers climbing rugged slopes. Newsreels revealed Panzers fording rivers with unstoppable determination. Even in training manuals, there was a clear sense of pride. German tanks were precise, efficient, elegant in their engineering logic. American tanks, by contrast, were dismissed as inferior, cheaply mass-produced, thinly armoured, rushed and crude. These were common phrases, repeated in leaflets, officer briefings, and even casual discussion among tank crews. Many German tankers internalized these claims not out of arrogance, but because they seemed to match the observed battlefield reality of earlier years, especially in North Africa, where the early Shermans struggled against the long-barreled Panzer IV and the lethal ambushes of the Panzer III with its high-velocity 50mm gun. The German soldiers' worldview had also been shaped by the cultural prestige of engineering. Even civilians in the Reich had been raised with the belief that German mechanical products were inherently superior. The nation's academic institutions and vocational traditions had long upheld precision craftsmanship as a pillar of national identity. That belief did not disappear in wartime. It intensified. Something as simple as the smooth gearing of a Panzer's turret traverse, or the polished finish of a Maybach engine component, reinforced the idea that German machines were crafted, not merely assembled. Thus, when German crews confronted the Sherman on the battlefield, they tended to focus on its weaknesses: the welded hull plates, the high profile, the relatively thin armour across the front hull. Propaganda leaflets circulated through the Wehrmacht emphasized the Sherman's tendency to ignite when penetrated, earning it the cruel and technically inaccurate nickname Tommy Cooker. Even German civilians, far from the front, heard tales of how a single Panther could knock out multiple Shermans from well beyond the range of return fire. But this narrative, however comforting, was selective. It talked about armour and firepower. It did not talk about fuel quality, or spare parts logistics, or crew ergonomics, or the surprising mechanical reliability of American engines. It did not discuss how quickly a Sherman could be repaired after damage, or how rapidly American industry could replace a vehicle lost in combat. And it certainly did not address something German doctrine had come to neglect almost completely by 1944: sustained operational mobility. German tank crews were told, formally and informally, that their vehicles were the fastest machines on the battlefield. The Panzer IV's maximum theoretical road speed was often quoted as more than twice its safe operational speed. The Panther was listed on paper as capable of reaching nearly 50 kilometers per hour on roads, a figure repeated endlessly in manuals and briefings. Even the Tiger was said to possess surprising mobility for its weight class. But these numbers lived on paper, not in the mud and grit of actual operations. The average German tanker knew that the vehicles rarely, if ever, achieved their advertised speeds. Track wear, engine strain, and the constant fear of mechanical breakdown led crews to avoid prolonged high-speed movement. Fuel shortages, especially from late 1943 onward, further discouraged anything resembling aggressive mobility. German tank engines, highly tuned, finely machined, and unforgiving of poor maintenance, simply did not tolerate reckless operation. This was the unseen contradiction of German armoured doctrine. The emphasis on precision engineering created vehicles that demanded precision maintenance, precision logistics, and precision fuel. And by late 1944, the Reich had very little of any of those. What German crews did not know, and what Reimann would discover firsthand that day at Kummersdorf, was that American design philosophy had followed an entirely different path. The Sherman was engineered not as a monument to craftsmanship, but as a tool designed for mass production, ease of repair, and consistent performance under extreme conditions. Its engine options, particularly the Ford GAA Vate gasoline engine used in the M-four-A-three variant, produced more horsepower per weight than most German equivalents. Its transmission could handle abrupt acceleration without catastrophic stress. Its suspension absorbed terrain irregularities at speeds German vehicles would never attempt. And because American logistics supplied abundant spare parts, crews felt comfortable operating close to the limits of the machine's endurance. These were not details German propaganda ever mentioned. And so, when the captured Sherman was rolled off the train at Kummersdorf, when the test officers opened the engine deck and saw the relatively simple layout of the Ford power plant, the first reaction was confusion. Where were the complicated German-style fittings? Where were the expected maintenance headaches? How could something so plain, so inelegant, function in frontline conditions? The answer, they would soon learn, was that it functioned because it was plain, functioned because it was inelegant, and functioned because it embraced a philosophy Germany had abandoned years before: capacity over complexity. Now, as the test officers assembled around the captured tank and the crew began preparing for the mobility run, Reimann could not shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something he did not yet understand. He was a veteran tanker, a man who had spent years inside Panzer compartments, a man who had seen the war from Poland to the outskirts of Kursk and back into the Reich. He thought he knew how tanks behaved. He thought he knew the limits of physics for a tracked machine weighing more than 30 tons. He thought he knew the truth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He was wrong, and the engine idling behind him was about to prove it. The crew assembled around the Sherman with a kind of hesitant choreography, as if touching the foreign machine required a moment of quiet mental adjustment. Reimann watched his gunner, Feldwebel Otto Hartmann, circle the vehicle with narrowed eyes. Hartmann had always been the most skeptical of anything not built in Germany. He ran 2 fingers across the cast turret, as if expecting his hand to come away coated in some inferior American alloy. "Feels like a bathtub," he muttered. "Rounded like a toy. Our Panthers have edges for a reason." Reimann didn't reply. He wasn't interested in doctrine at that moment, only in what the machine could do. Beyond the yard, engineers in grey coats set up range markers and speed posts along the testing course. A flat stretch of compacted earth, followed by a shallow rise, then a diagonal turn into a series of uneven ground pits designed to simulate battlefield conditions. Normally, only German vehicles ran through these courses, the familiar shapes of the Panzer IV, Panther, or the occasional Tiger I rumbling across the tracks with a deep, resonant growl that echoed across the pines. Today, however, the American machine would lead the run. Hauptmann Weiss, the officer overseeing the evaluation, approached with a clipboard of notes and a cigarette hanging at a calculated angle from the corner of his mouth. He was 50, older than most line officers, and carried the permanent exhaustion of a man who had been writing increasingly pessimistic reports for 2 years straight. "Reimann," he called out, "your crew is confirmed for the mobility sequence. No gunnery today, just speed, maneuverability, obstacle performance." "Yes, Herr Hauptmann." Weiss flicked ash toward the concrete. "You will drive her as if you intend to break her, but without actually doing so. Understand? Do not baby the machine. I want to see what it can tolerate." That phrasing caught Hartmann off guard. "Break it? Sir, with respect, this is foreign equipment. We don't fully understand the tolerances." Weiss raised an eyebrow. "Exactly why we test it. American crews push these vehicles hard in the field. Very hard. We need to know whether this is empty bravado or mechanical reality." Reimann nodded, silently acknowledging the deeper implication. If American tanks could truly maintain high-speed maneuvering across varied terrain, then Allied armoured divisions possessed an operational advantage. Germany could no longer match regardless of armour, thickness or gun performance. "Into positions," Weiss ordered. Reimann climbed atop the Sherman, swung open the driver's hatch, and lowered himself into the compartment. Immediately, he felt the difference. The interior layout was almost spacious compared to the cramped geometry of German tanks. Levers, pedals, and gauges were arranged with an ergonomic simplicity that bordered on elegance. The seat padding felt unusually thick, Even the driver's periscope had a clarity he wasn't expecting. Hartmann slid into the gunner's position, shaking his head with theatrical disapproval. "Feels like an American automobile in here," Reimann smirked. "Maybe that's their intention." From behind, the Ford GAA V8 engine rumbled with a deep, smooth timbre, nothing like the distinctive clattering resonance of a Maybach. He checked the throttle linkage, shifted into neutral, and tapped the accelerator lightly. The engine responded instantly. No hesitation, no sputter, no mechanical complaint. It was the first moment he felt something like unease. "Stand by for first." "Run!" Weiss shouted from outside, his voice sharp and formal. 1 kilometer, straight course, maximum safe acceleration. "Copy," Reimann said. He gripped the control levers, settled his boots against the pedals, and waited for the signal. When the flag dropped, he pushed the throttle forward with firm, decisive pressure. The Sherman lunged, not rolled, not accelerated gradually. Lunged. The entire hull surged forward with a momentum that pressed Reimann against his seat. The engine roared confidently, almost enthusiastically, as if the machine had been waiting for the chance to run. The treads bit into the earth, kicking up a spray of dust that hung behind them like a comet's tail. Within seconds, they were moving faster than Reimann had ever taken a Panzer IV on rough ground without risking a thrown track or mechanical damage. He glanced at the speed gauge. His eyebrows shot up. "This can't be right," Hartmann muttered, bracing himself against the turret ring as they hit the first shallow depression. But it was right. The Sherman wasn't just fast, it was comfortably fast. It absorbed the bumps with a steady, controlled recoil through the suspension. No jarring impact, no violent bucking, no fear of catastrophic damage to the drivetrain. Reimann tightened his grip on the controls and pushed the throttle further. The tank responded instantly again, accelerating with a smoothness that defied everything he knew about 30-ton steel vehicles. The wind howled against the hull. The engine bellowed like a living animal. The speed markers blurred as they passed. When they reached the end of the first kilometer and slowed to a halt, he opened the hatch and sucked in a breath of cold air. Weiss approached briskly, his expression caught somewhere between suspicion and disbelief. "Report." Reimann hesitated. "Herr Hauptmann, this machine moves like—" He searched for the right comparison. "Like it wants to run." Weiss scowled. "Your speed readings seem inflated." "They're not," Reimann replied. "This tank truly moves at that pace." Weiss tapped the side of the Sherman with his pen. Again, this time through the obstacle course. The second run would be the real test. The obstacle course had broken vehicles before, usually overloaded half-tracks or the occasional Panzer III prototype. It featured uneven terrain pits, angled inclines, and a tight-shaped turn carved between two timber barriers. German tank crews navigated it with caution born of necessity. A broken torsion bar meant a vehicle was out of action for days, sometimes weeks. The Sherman gave no such impression of fragility. When the signal came, Reimann put the throttle past the midpoint and guided the tank toward the first set of terrain pits. The ground dropped into a trough, then rose sharply, something a Panther took with stiff reluctance, its suspension slamming hard against the hull. The Sherman dipped gracefully, almost fluidly, and climbed out without losing momentum. Hartmann grabbed a handhold. "This isn't normal," he muttered. "No 30-ton machine should take terrain like this." But the Sherman did. The angled incline came next. Reimann steered into the slope at a shallow entry angle, expecting some track slip or engine strain. Instead, the tank powered upward without complaint, the engine maintaining a consistent, confident growl. By the time they approached the shaped turn, even Reimann felt a mix of awe and discomfort, like witnessing a violation of the equipment limits he'd internalized after years in German vehicles. The Sherman handled the turn with clean, responsive steering. The differential transmitted power with almost automotive smoothness, allowing a tight pivot without oversteer or stalling. When they finished the run and returned to the starting line, a silent crowd had formed. Weiss studied the tank as though trying to see through its steel skin. "Reimann," he said quietly, Would you characterize the machine's mobility as equal to the Panzer IV? Reimann swallowed. No, sir. Less than? Weiss prompted. No. Weiss looked directly at him. Then more. Reimann exhaled. Significantly more. A murmur spread through the assembled crewmen and engineers. Weiss tapped the clipboard with a stiff, uncomfortable rhythm. Again, he ordered. Third run. Harder. And so the tests continued. Run after run, the Sherman delivered consistent, almost unsettling performance. Its engine tolerated repeated high-speed accelerations without overheating. Its suspension absorbed impacts that would have risked internal damage in German designs. The transmission never complained, never hesitated, never felt like it was one bad shift away from seizing. By the fourth run, the engineers were openly whispering among themselves. By the fifth, Weiss's cigarette had burned down to the filter. During a brief pause between runs, Hartmann leaned toward Reimann and spoke in a low voice. If American tanks can move like this in the field, how do we defeat that? A tank that gets into position first, a tank that can flank before we can react? Reimann didn't answer. He didn't have one. At sunset, with the sky turning violet and the cold settling heavily across the test grounds, Weiss finally called an end to the evaluation. The Sherman, still rumbling confidently, seemed almost eager for another run. Reimann powered down the engine and climbed out of the hatch. The sudden silence felt heavier than the sound. Weiss approached him slowly, his expression unreadable. You will write a full report, the Hauptmann said. Include everything. Do not embellish. Do not soften the numbers. The High Command may ignore it, but the data must exist. Yes, sir. Weiss looked back at the Sherman. It appears we have underestimated the Americans. Their tanks may lack the armor of a Panther or the firepower of a long-barreled 75. But they possess something we no longer do. Mobility, Reimann said quietly. Reliability, Weiss added. He paused, then spoke with a rare softness. And industrial confidence. The wind rustled through the pine trees. Somewhere in the distance, a Panther engine sputtered during ignition, coughing, struggling, then catching with a reluctant rumble. Reimann turned to the vehicle he had spent all afternoon driving. It outran us, he murmured. Hartmann nodded. It outran everything. And the truth settled over them like the evening cold. Their war had entered a phase where the enemy's machines, simple, rugged, unpretentious, possessed the one advantage Germany could no longer manufacture. Speed. Not the theoretical speed of manuals and propaganda. Real speed. Speed across mud, across fields, across ruined villages and battered roads. Speed that meant arriving first, striking first, escaping first. Speed that could decide the fate of armoured divisions. For the first time, Reimann felt a quiet, heavy certainty that German armoured doctrine had reached its limit, and the American tank idling gently beside him was the silent proof. Night at Kummersdorf had its own kind of gravity. When the engines shut down and the tools were set aside, when the last officers left the testing grounds and the floodlights flicked on with a faint crackling hum, the place transformed from a bustling technical centre into a landscape of steel silhouettes and long, uneasy shadows. The captured Sherman stood among the German vehicles like an uninvited guest at a formal gathering, a shape at odds with its surroundings, rounded where everything else was angular, foreign in posture and spirit. The Panzer IV beside it looked lean, almost gaunt, as if it had aged 10 years in a single afternoon, just by being forced to share space with a machine that refused to behave as German expectations demanded. Reimann and his crew were assigned to remain near the Sherman overnight to ensure no clandestine tampering occurred, whether by over-curious technicians or by frustrated rival crews who bristled at the day's revelations. The order was routine, but it carried an undercurrent of tension that felt new. Some machines demanded respect, others demanded vigilance. This one demanded both. As the wind picked up, whistling between the buildings, Reimann sat on a crate beside the Sherman's left track and lit a cigarette. The first inhale steadied him, the smoke curling upward and dissolving into the cold air. Hartmann emerged from the dim light of the maintenance shed, carrying 2 enamel cups of dark coffee, overboiled, bitter, and unmistakably German. He handed 1 cup to Reimann, then leaned against the hull of the American tank with a sigh heavy enough to bend metal. "Do you realize what today means?" Hartmann asked quietly. Reimann exhaled smoke. "That propaganda has been lying to us since Africa?" Hartmann gave a humorless chuckle. "That was obvious years ago. I mean the other thing." Reimann raised an eyebrow. "That tank," Hartmann said, tapping the Sherman with the back of his knuckle, "isn't just another enemy vehicle. It's a message. It tells us the Americans are not fighting the same war we are. They're fighting a war of movement, a war of supply, a war where losing 10 tanks doesn't matter, because they'll ship 20 more next week." Reimann stayed silent. Hartmann continued, voice low, almost as if he feared the Sherman might be listening. "Do you remember Kursk? How many Panthers broke down before they even reached the front line? Engines overheating, final drives failing. We lost more machines to mechanical failure than to Soviet guns that first week." Reimann nodded grimly. "And now," Hartmann said, gesturing at the American tank, "we see that our opponents have vehicles that can run all day without complaining. Vehicles that crews can push to the limit without fearing they'll destroy them." He met Reimann's eyes. "How do we win against that?" There was no simple answer. There never had been. Reimann stared at the ground, the cigarette burning down between his fingers. The truth weighed on him not as a sudden revelation, but as an accumulation of all the things he'd witnessed since the first day of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Vehicles immobilized in mud, engines seizing, transmissions cracking, parts cannibalized from one tank to repair another. The German army had marched east with confidence, but it was an industrial giant built on fragile legs. Precision engineering was magnificent in ideal conditions, but in war, real war, it became a liability. He took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. "We don't win, not anymore. The only question now is how long we can delay the inevitable." Hartmann didn't argue. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the distant clatter of a railway car being loaded and the faint pop of cooling metal from the Sherman's engine compartment. Finally, Hartmann broke the silence. "Weiss said he wants cross-comparison runs tomorrow." Reimann looked up. "Against what?" "Panther. Panzer IV. Maybe even a Tiger I if they can get one started." Reimann almost smiled. "The Tiger will throw a track before it reaches the 3rd marker," Hartmann smirked. "Or the gearbox will scream for mercy." They both knew it wasn't entirely a joke. Before they could continue, footsteps approached from the direction of the barracks. Lieutenant Emil Brecht, young, tense, and far too ambitious for his own well-being, strode toward them with a clipboard in hand. "Unteroffizier Jakob," Brecht began. "I've been instructed to collect your preliminary observations." Reimann tapped ash onto the dirt. "Already submitted to Hauptmann Weiss." Brecht adjusted his wire-rim glasses impatiently. "Not those. Your personal impressions, the subjective ones." Frowned. "Why?" Brecht glanced over his shoulder as though afraid someone might overhear. "Because Berlin wants them." That caught Reimann off guard. "Berlin?" he echoed. Brecht nodded. "Technical Bureau. They want to understand how frontline crews respond to American vehicles, their effectiveness, their psychological impact." Hartmann let out a short, derisive laugh. "Psychological? After 5 years of war and 2 million dead, now they're worried about psychology?" Brecht stiffened. This is not an opportunity for sarcasm, Feldwebel. But his voice lacked conviction, and he knew it. Reimann studied Brecht's expression carefully. There was fear there, real fear, not of Reimann or Hartmann, but of the implications of the day's results. "Lieutenant," Reimann said gently, "have you read the maintenance logs from the Panther battalions on the Western Front?" Brecht hesitated. "Some. Then you know what they say. 2/3 operational rates, persistent final drive failures, limited fuel, crew exhaustion." Brecht didn't answer. Reimann continued, quietly but firmly. And today, this vehicle, he motioned to the Sherman, ran 5 mobility tests without a single mechanical complaint, without overheating, without shedding a track, without demanding a maintenance crew the moment it stopped. Brecht swallowed. His knuckles tightened around the clipboard. "Write it," he whispered. "Write all of it, even if they don't want to believe it." And with that, he walked away into the shadows. When he was gone, Hartmann shook his head slowly. "They're scared." "No," Reimann corrected softly. "They're realizing." It was a different kind of fear, the kind that came from finally seeing the shape of the world beyond illusion. At dawn, frost coated the ground, crunching under boots and tracks. The engineers prepared the measured course again, while a Panther and a Panzer IV were rolled out for comparison tests. The Tiger I never showed. An apologetic mechanic explained that the vehicle refused to start, and no amount of persuasion, mechanical or verbal, had changed its mind. Weiss stood beside the Sherman with a renewed stiffness in his posture. He held a sheaf of papers filled with measurements from the previous day. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw clenched. "Today," he announced, "we will compare performance objectively. No assumptions, no ideology, numbers only." The Panzer IV ran the course first. It managed respectable acceleration at the start, but its engine strain became evident before the halfway point. By the time it reached the obstacle pits, the driver had to reduce speed to avoid risking structural stress. Next came the Panther. Its engine roared with power, but the initial surge faltered as the gearbox hesitated, a phenomenon every Panther crew knew too well. The vehicle struggled through the tight S-turn, its steering system protesting with a grinding, metallic groan. Finally, the Sherman took its place again. Reimann climbed into the driver's seat with a familiarity he didn't want to admit. The interior no longer felt foreign. It felt sensible. The flag dropped. The Sherman surged forward, almost playful in its confidence. It reached the first marker faster than either German tank. It hit the obstacle pits at a speed that would have been reckless for a Panzer IV, but the suspension absorbed the impact like a sponge. It completed the S-turn without slipping a track. When they finished, Weiss approached silently. He didn't need to say the words, they were written in the deepening lines around his eyes. Reimann dismounted from the Sherman and waited. At last, Weiss spoke. "The Americans," he said slowly, "have achieved what we have failed to balance: power, simplicity, and reliability in a single platform." He gestured toward the Panther. "This tank was our masterpiece, a triumph of engineering." Then he pointed at the Sherman. "That one is their tool." War favors tools. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of exhaust and pine resin. Reimann knew what Weiss meant. A German tank was a work of art, beautiful, deadly, temperamental. An American tank was a hammer, and on the battlefield of 1944, the side with more hammers would always win. As the sun climbed higher and the frost melted, Weiss gathered the crews, engineers, and officers into a loose semicircle. He held up the clipboard, containing the day's data. "These results," he announced, "are not to be dismissed. They challenge fundamental assumptions held at every level of command. Some will choose to ignore them, some will deny them, but history does not bend to ideology." He paused. "It bends to capability." The men shifted uneasily. Weiss inhaled deeply. "The Sherman outruns our tanks. It outmaneuvers them. It survives harsh terrain better. And its crews, supported by endless fuel, parts, and replacements, can operate aggressively without fear of mechanical failure." He lowered the clipboard. "This is the reality." Reimann felt a ripple pass through the assembled men: shock, denial, acceptance, all swirling together like conflicting currents in a river. It was not the revelation itself that weighed on them. It was what it meant. If the Sherman was faster, tougher, and more reliable, then the war in the West was unwinnable, not because German tanks were weak, but because they were outnumbered, outbuilt, and outpaced by a nation that treated war as an extension of industry. Reimann looked at the Sherman one last time. It rested quietly, engine ticking faintly as it cooled. A machine without pride, without arrogance. A machine built not to impress, but to endure. And in that realization, the truth crystallized. Germany had built tanks for victory. America had built tanks for war. And war, in the end, rewards the practical. Winter arrived at Kummersdorf with a quiet, resigned bitterness, as though the land itself had grown tired of carrying the weight of war. Snow fell in thin veils across the proving grounds, settling on turret roofs and engine decks, softening the outlines of steel giants that had once symbolized confidence, ambition, and terrifying momentum. Now they stood motionless, lined up in cold rows that looked less like machines of conquest and more like unfinished monuments to a fading era. In the small wooden barracks near the edge of the testing field, Unteroffizier Jakob Reimann sat alone at a narrow desk, a lantern flickering beside him. A blank report sheet lay in front of him, stamped at the top with the emblem of the Waffenamt, the weapons office. He had been ordered to compile the final summary of the Sherman evaluation, the kind of formal conclusion that would be filed, reviewed, circulated, then buried beneath the avalanche of crises overwhelming Berlin. Outside the barracks, the Sherman rested under a thin layer of frost. Its rounded turret and broad hull looked strangely peaceful beneath the snow, like a sleeping animal that had wandered into enemy territory and found nothing worth fearing. Reimann dipped his pen into the inkwell. The words came slowly at first. The captured M-four-A-three medium tank demonstrates mobility characteristics exceeding those of current German models, including Panzer IV-Ausf-H and Panther Ausf-G. He paused and rubbed his forehead. The technical language felt insufficient, hollow, even. Numbers and measurements could not fully convey the experience of driving the machine, the unsettling ease with which it absorbed terrain, the way it shrugged off the obstacles that strained German suspensions to their limits. He continued writing. The American design prioritizes reliability, simplified maintenance, and sustained operational tempo. These qualities, though lacking in refinement, deliver substantial tactical and logistical benefits in prolonged engagements. Snow tapped against the window, soft, rhythmic, indifferent. In repeated trials, the vehicle exhibited consistent acceleration, minimal engine stress, and stable handling across uneven ground. Notably, the machine tolerated aggressive maneuvering without mechanical failure. He hesitated again. This report would be read by officers who still believed that German engineering represented the apex of modern warfare. Officers who believed that the Panther's sloped armor and the Tiger's monstrous gun compensated for every shortcoming. Officers who would dismiss the Sherman because it was not beautiful, not intimidating, not worthy of admiration. But tanks were not soldiers. They had no pride to wound. Machines cared only about movement, fuel, and the ability to keep going. Reimann dipped his pen once more. It is the assessment of this crew that the Sherman's greatest strength is not its armor, nor its firepower, but its ability to sustain combat, operations with minimal logistical burden. The vehicle is forgiving to its crew. It is simple to service. It can be driven at high speeds without fear. He stared at the page. Then he added the line he knew would cause discomfort. It is, in all essential respects, a superior battlefield tool. The lantern sputtered, as if reacting to the sentence. Hartmann would have smirked at that. Reimann allowed himself a moment to reflect not on doctrine or engineering reports, but on the men who fought inside these machines. German tankers had been raised on the mythology of precision. American tankers had been raised on the practicality of abundance. And when the two philosophies collided on the battlefields of France, Belgium, and the Ardennes, practicality proved more durable. He finished the report. The Sherman embodies the industrial philosophy of the United States. Large-scale production, standardized parts, and a focus on operational reliability. Its capabilities represent a decisive advantage in the current phase of the conflict. He signed his name with a steady hand. Jakob Reimann, Unteroffizier. 7. Panzer Regiment Kummersdorf, Proving Grounds, December 1944. He blew gently on the ink until it dried, then folded the report into its envelope. For a long moment he did not move. He listened to the stillness outside, the distant hum of a generator, the creaking of metal contracting in the cold, and the faint sigh of winter wind passing across the German armour lined up in the snow. Machines that had once roared across Europe now slept like relics. Finally, he stood, put on his coat, and stepped outside into the frigid night. The Sherman loomed beside the Panther like a parable cast in steel, one built by a country with limitless resources, the other by a country with limitless ambition but dwindling means. Reimann brushed the snow from the Sherman's fender. "This isn't your fault," he murmured to the machine. "You were built to work. We were built to hope." He turned to leave. Then he paused, looking back at the tank illuminated by the pale winter moon. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant. It did not inspire awe. But it would be remembered because it survived. Because it did what it was built to do. Because in the end, war rewards endurance more than brilliance. Reimann walked toward the headquarters building, envelope in hand. Behind him, the Sherman remained silent, unassuming, and steady, its presence a quiet verdict on the war Germany had once believed it would win. And as he trudged through the snow, Reimann understood with final clarity: history belongs not to the most fearsome machine, nor to the most advanced, but to the one that arrives, fights, and returns again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.